So yes, well, thank you very much for coming and to hear about Elizabeth Raffald. I've been writing the talk and shifting things around over the last few days. And one of the things that's been hard for me to judge is, of course, where people are coming from. Some of you may know Elizabeth very well and know a lot about her. Some people might have heard her name in passing, especially if you live in Manchester. And some of you will have no idea who she is at all. So we shall see how we get on. And I thought maybe the best way to get on would be to talk very briefly about how I know her. Oh, before I go on, by the way, if you think of anything over the next 24 hours, whenever I go to a talk, I find it really hard to think of a question. It takes me a good 24 hours to digest it and then think of things to say. So if anybody's got any questions afterwards, there's my email, or if you prefer your social media, that's my Twitter, Instagram, and I've got a discussion group, which is called British Food History on Facebook, if anybody's on Facebook as well. So I just thought I'd mention those things. I think they're on the last slide of the talk as well. So don't worry if you don't note those things down. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my relationship with Elizabeth Raffald. It precedes the book that I've just written about her by quite a bit. All the way back in 2008, I decided to write a blog where I cooked every recipe in Jane Grigson's English Food. Here is my copy. It has no spine. It's completely fallen to bits. There's 450 recipes in there. I still haven't finished it. I've got about 4 left to do. But I started this blog, well, first of all, because I didn't really cook British food that much and didn't know much about food traditions or history. And second, I just started a PhD and I was very worried. I'd been out of academia for a few years and I was very worried about writing and that fear that I'm sure you're all familiar with, of that having that page with a blank screen and a cursor flashing at the top, and you just kind of get a bit stressed. So what I thought I would do was write, and it didn't matter what I was writing about, I just needed to get used to writing. And the fact it was a blog just kind of upped the ante, because then there was a slight chance that someone might read it. So I'd better make sure it was good. I'm not sure how successful I was there. But I got to recipe number 40, as you can see, and here is Elizabeth Raffald's orange custards, and they're very nice, by the way. But the important thing is, and if you know about Jane Grigson's books, you'll know that she writes these fantastic introductions to her recipes. And here she gives a potted biography of Elizabeth Raffald, and kind of with a list of all the things that she'd done, setting up her food shops, her domestic servants employment agency, Manchester inns that she ran, directories, all these things. And at the bottom, the thing that people, if people do know her, the reason that she's famous is because of her book, The Experienced English Housekeeper. I just couldn't believe what I was reading. I cooked a few more recipes in Jane's book, and there's a few more Raffald recipes in there too, and they were all great. So I thought, I need to find out more about this person. So what happened, kind of year into my little blogging project, I bought my first historical cookbook, which was a 1997 reprint of The Experienced English Housekeeper, written with an introduction by Roy Shipperbottom. And she popped up in my blog. I ended up doing a second blog, and she cropped up all the time. I always visited her. So really, for me, Jane Grigson and Elizabeth Raffald have essentially been with me right from the beginning. Back when I didn't realize this was going to be my career, it was just a hobby, really. So fast forward to 2021, I'd been asked to write a dark history of sugar by Pen and Sword History, and they liked it, few, because it was my first book, so that was a relief. And they said, by the way, have you got any ideas of your own? And I immediately said, yes. No one's written a book about Elizabeth Raffald. They had no idea who she is. And I said, well, don't worry about that. This is why she's fantastic. And they said, yep, great, go off and write it. I made it sound a little bit easier than it was, but I went off and wrote it. And then, just as it's published, I've been talking to some other people, other food historians, and one of them put me in contact with somebody specialized in trading antiquarian books. This was just when the book came out. This was very exciting because a first edition Elizabeth Raffald had appeared. So I thought, I'm going to have to go see this. I thought, I'm not going to buy it because I'm going to have to remortgage my house or something. But luckily for me, there was a few pages missing. So that meant it was actually affordable. And I managed to get hold of a first edition. There it is. Doesn't look very much, but I'll talk about that again in a little bit. And when I got there, I'm not a superstitious kind of person, but when I got there, what did she have but a first edition Jane Grigson, which is really weird. So I thought, well, the Raffald was much cheaper than I expected. So I thought, well, I'll splash out and get a Jane Grigson as well. So that's my sort of journey with Elizabeth. Like I say, so she's really important to me, and I've obviously got to know her at least as much as you can over the last few years as I've researched her and written about her in detail. I thought quickly talk about the sources that I've used, the primary sources from the time she was around, and then some secondary sources, other people have written about her or her times. When it comes to primary sources, well, there's her book, The Experienced English Housekeeper, obviously important. Second is the Arley Hall Archives. And if you just type in Arley Hall Archives into Google, it's the first thing that comes up. And it's a free online resource with, well, most of the receipts, shopping lists, all sorts of information about servants, how much they were paid, whatever you like, really, from Arley Hall. And amongst those things are receipts and shopping lists written by Elizabeth herself. She was born Elizabeth Whitaker. This is before she was married, and there's one of her lists. So that was very important, very useful, especially talking about her first years or her final years in domestic service. The most important one, the Manchester Mercury, the 18th century newspaper in Manchester. She, in a whole time that she's lived in Manchester, she advertised various projects, announcements. At one point, there was more than one per week. So they're really useful because you can track what she's doing and where she is. And then also there's her, and this doesn't get mentioned too much, she also wrote, it would turn out 3 editions of the Manchester and Salford Directory, which is basically an A to Z or a Yellow Pages, an 18th century Yellow Pages, which is a great glimpse into the minutiae of the people that were living in Manchester across 3 different years, and the three different years that she brought the books out. When it comes to secondary sources, going back to that book that I bought in 1997, there's an introduction by Roy Shipperbottom. He was a food historian. He unfortunately died, I think, 2 months before this reissue came out. But he writes this fantastic, it's got a beautiful writing style, and he writes a very dense, maybe 6-page biography of Elizabeth at the beginning. So that was really useful. It's got lots of information there that I couldn't find anywhere else. So very useful. This chap here is Charles Foster. He's was the Arley Hall historian. He set up the archives online, but he's also written various books about stately homes and the Industrial Revolution in Cheshire and the north of England. So he assimilated a lot of his own data, worked out things like how much sugar everybody was eating per week, that kind of stuff. So that was really useful too. But head and shoulders above everyone else is the newspapers, the other newspapers that came afterwards, in particular, the Manchester Guardian, which would go on to be just called the Guardian. And if you live in the UK, you'll know and love or hate it, depending on your political leanings. But there was some written in the mid-19th century by a guy called John Harland, and he was a Raffald obsessive, and he wrote quite a few articles, and he managed to interview some of her descendants, one of which her nephew was alive at the same time as her and could tell him some stories. So there's lots of family stories that he was able to capture, which had he just waited another 5 or 10 years, he would not have caught. So really useful. And then lastly, in the 2010s, here we've got Suze Appleton, another person who just kind of discovered Elizabeth and became obsessed by her. And she has spent a lot of time and energy collecting sources together. And she's also written transcriptions of books and published them. You can get those on Amazon, so they're worth checking out. Her directories, I think she's transcribed, and I think the 12th edition of Elizabeth's cookery book, amongst other things. So I did all my reading, and as a historian, I'm really bad with dates. So what I did, first of all, was made a timeline to help me out. And this is by time.graphics. And if you do the free version, which I did, because I'm from Yorkshire, I didn't want to spend any money if I didn't have to. This is public. So you can search Time Graphics and Elizabeth Raffald, and you can have a look at the timeline. It's all, you can zoom in, zoom out, move it around. So I thought you might find that interesting. It's also useful just to quickly talk about her early life. So she was born in 1733 in Doncaster, South Yorkshire. We don't know very much about her early life, to be honest. But what's useful, I guess, for her narrative is that her father, a tutor, gave her and her sisters, so as we know, she just had sisters, no brothers, gave them a good education and taught them French, or at least conversational French. So it really put her ahead of, other people, not just other women, but, other people of her class at the time. She goes into domestic service. We don't know anything really about her years in domestic service before she got to Arley Hall. She mentions a few things in the Experienced English Housekeeper, that she was in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, for example. We know she spent a lot of time in York, visiting there frequently, maybe with ladies of the house that she was employed by, or maybe just working short contracts. We don't know the nature of it really. What we do know is that she started working in Arley Hall in December 1760. Up here at the top corner, this is Arley Hall as it is now. It's been rebuilt a couple of times since Elizabeth's years there. But I thought you might want to have a look at it. It's a very big hall. Her salary was £16 a year. That would be up to the previous housekeeper was on, if I remember rightly, £12 a year. And I thought I'd quickly talk about the roles of a housekeeper in a large house like this, because I wasn't sure how much people would know. This picture here is a portrait of 6 servants by William Hogarth, and it's one of the few naturalistic representations that we have of servants in the 18th century. So I thought I'd put this on because this is a glimpse into the way that servants at this time were really dressing. And well, no one really knows what everybody was doing in this picture, but we think this person here must have been his housekeeper. So one of the main roles of the housekeeper was to manage all of the female staff in the house. Everybody was below her except for the ladies in waiting, who of course tended to the lady of the house and the other female relatives that lived there. She actually had to protect the female staff a lot too. There was lots of, well, wanted stroke unwanted, depending, sexual advances from the other male servants, and sometimes from her employer's family. And it would sometimes get so bad that, young girls would have to be locked in their rooms. It could get quite fraught. It was quite a difficult life for young people in houses like this, which were cut off because you didn't really meet anybody, because there was nowhere you couldn't run off and go into the local tavern because there wasn't one. They were out in the sticks. And even if you did live somewhere that was close to a village, you often wouldn't be allowed in case you did go to the tavern and get a little bit drunk, because that wouldn't look good. So it could be quite a lonely life for the younger people. But talking about food, because that's, I guess, what we're maybe more interested in, she ordered the basic foods. So it was things like fruit and vegetables, that filling in the gaps that wasn't being produced in the kitchen gardens, fish and game and poultry as well. Very important, but not very glamorous, was preserving. It was really important, preserving all the surplus food, all the seasonal food from the kitchen gardens, making conserves, alcohols, distilling, also potting and collaring meat and fish. And it was really important because, it was good home economics, of course, not to waste food, but also it kept a good variety of food throughout the year, especially in wintertime, which is, the hunger gap, and there's not much fresh fruit or veg around. This is more Elizabeth specifically, I suppose. She was a talented confectioner. We maybe call it a patissier today. It's a similar job. She made her cheesecake. She was very good at cheesecakes. She did a lot of sugar work, and she used to make spun sugar webs, something that we'll probably think of as something that's quite modern, but she was making them 250 years ago. And something that she became really famous for was her edible table decorations. We're going to talk about those a little bit more in a second, but these are amazing, often made out of jelly and flummery, which is basically a kind of blancmange or jelly with milk in it. So it wasn't see-through, it was opaque. She made these fantastic things. She liaised with Lady Elizabeth Warburton, affectionately called Lady Betty. When she first married her husband, Peter Warburton, she was her own housekeeper. So she worked very closely with any employed housekeepers afterwards. And they struck up a really good relationship. And she carried on, after Elizabeth left, she came to Arley Hall a few times to visit and to drop things off and do special deliveries for them. And I'm assuming they visited her as well. They were a well-traveled family. She also had to liaise with the house steward, who was called Peter Harper. He ran the estates. So he collected rents, he collected food, grains, milk, dairy, depending on, there was a whole variety of different farms and farmers on the estates. He also ordered the fancier food and the more expensive food. So the meat, the spices, tea, chocolate, coffee. She had to organize a kitchen day to day. And she had to run special events and use very exotic ingredients, some of which were made by the head gardener, John Raffald. So she had to liaise with him quite a lot. And what I've got here is I took a few photographs from the back of the book, because she has a book on seasonality, a part on seasonality at the back. And you've got April here. I mean, you can see the amazing variety that was able to be grown, in the UK. In the north of England. It was not the best. But if you go up to just before April, here into March, forced strawberries are being grown. And if you look in April down here, we've got forced cherries and apricots. I mean, good luck growing apricots normally in England. But people like gardeners like John Raffald was able to do this. Here's a picture of Arley's walled garden. So this was their food garden, the kitchen garden, and these walls have great big cavities in them, and they would burn charcoal in there to make hot walls, and they would grow things like apricots and figs out of season against these hot walls. And this other page here, this is from we're getting more into autumn, and again still a good variety of foods. And what you got here, melons and pineapples also being grown at great expense, huge amount of energy. So that's the kind of stuff that was going on. And she was fuddling all this stuff, all these exotic ingredients, to special events. And at the back of the book, again, she has directions of a grand table, which is basically a really fancy feast that she says should be done in January. So I'm assuming it's 12th night that we're talking about, because that was the peak celebration around Christmas. She has a 3-course meal. It's a service à la française, which means that you have lots of different dishes come on all at the same time. They all come off. And then you get a second course of lots of dishes. They come. And she did, for her grand table, 3 courses, each course 25 different dishes with no repeats. So 75 unique dishes. I wonder how many people manage to even carry off half of something like that in their homes. Who knows? And what I've got here is a sample of her writing, which I thought you might be interested in, where she's talking about spinning silver webs, doing sugar work. Because this is what kind of one of the things that set her aside from other people. She says, when you spin a silver web or a dessert, always take particular care your fire is clear and a pan of water upon the fire to keep the heat from your face and stomach, for fear the heat should make you faint. These women were having to really literally lean into fires often with their hands wrapped up with tea towels and cloths and things like that. And they would often faint, sometimes into the fire, and set themselves alight. And there were several deaths and many serious injuries in those kitchens. You know, we kind of think of Downton Abbey with everyone scurrying around in this nice romantic way, but that's not what it was like. So I had a go at doing a couple of her decorations, table decorations. I don't know, see what you think. Here, we've got her bacon and eggs in flummery. Like I was saying, flummery is basically a blancmange, what we think of a blancmange today, an almond-flavoured milky jelly. And the idea is that this is the streaky bacon, where you have two different flummeries. In her book, she's dyeing this with cochineal, but I used beetroot juice. And I just did layers of white flummery, like that set, then do a layer of pink flummery, like that set, in a tub. Then when it was full, I could turn it out and slice it up into little rashers. This is all from her book. This is just some flummery that I put into a coffee cup with half a tinned apricot on top. She didn't use tinned apricots, but I cheated. And over here, she has a Solomon's Temple in front flummery, which is extremely rare mold and it's difficult to get hold of. But I managed to find, I guess, what would you call that? A basilica? But what she did was she dyed it with cochineal again. That's her plain almond flummery. And the reason that I'm mentioning it is at the bottom, it was coffee and chocolate flavor. It must have cost a fortune to make all these exotic ingredients. And it is absolutely delicious. So I can highly recommend chocolate and coffee flavored flummery if you're thinking about making a dessert at the weekend. We need to have a little talk about John Raffald, very important for our story. He's a handsome and charismatic head gardener of Arley Hall. And it's his dream job. His family, the Raffalds, live in Stockport, which is a city just south of Manchester. And he is the eldest son, and he gave up his opportunity as the eldest son to inherit the family business. He said, no, thank you. I'm going to pursue my career working in stately homes, these really big market gardens. And also, this is a great age of landscaping. So it's really cutting edge stuff. So he said, well, thank you very much. And he gives it all to the next son down, James Raffald. But what happens is, at some point, Elizabeth and John made a decision to move to Manchester, which they did. And the problem is, I think, and if anybody's got any theories about what the conversation that they had must have been like, I'd be very pleased to know, because they moved to Manchester, get married, move to Manchester, and then John has to go get a job at his brother's market gardens, the ones that he gave up, you know, the inheritance that he gave up, he's going back to work there. So he's giving up his dream job and is going back to work for his brother. And it should be his business. So yeah, very odd. She must have been a very charismatic person herself to kind of talk him into it. It must have required a bit of talking in. Anyway, they get married just before they leave for Manchester. This is her very last receipt before she left. She's not Whitaker anymore. She's Elizabeth Raffald. And it's written the day that they actually moved to Manchester, this. She's been scribbling it just as she was getting into the carriage or whatever. So she moves into Fennel Street. It still exists, but none of the buildings are 18th century, unfortunately. I'm not going to talk about this place too much because it's the foundation for everything else that comes along, except to say I managed to find an 18th century drawing of Fennel Street. So who knows, one of these buildings could have been the one that she lived in, her and John lived in, and set up a business. This is the first advert, at least the earliest one I could find, that she put in a Manchester Mercury. And she's got 3 businesses going. She's got a register office, which is an employment agency. Here it is there. The system was if you were a servant or want to be a servant, you paid a shilling to be on the books. If you were an employer, you paid a shilling to be able to see those books. And it was quite a nice system. Manchester didn't have one. Elizabeth had a keen eye for what was lacking, and she jumped on it, and she noticed, you know, it's a rapidly growing town. It's not yet a city, and she could see that people were crying out for domestic servants. She had a shop selling things like brawn and pies, Newcastle salmon, which is a kind of preserved like potted salmon. And she also had a catering business. It's quite small at this point, but it grows. And she's basically just supplying families with what she calls them made dishes. In other words, if there's any gaps on their dinner table, maybe because they didn't have enough servants or they didn't have a large enough kitchen, she filled in those gaps for them. They outgrow those premises quite quickly, 3 years. And they end up at Marketplace. This is the really interesting bit, I think. Here's a detail from a map, 1816, so it's slightly after Elizabeth's time, but the important places are there. She moves to Marketplace, and I reckon from descriptions here, the North End, because it mentions, there's a mention that it's opposite the Shambles district, the old Shambles district. If you're familiar with Manchester city centre, here, that I'm outlining with my laser pointer, is the canker that is the Arndale Shopping Centre. And here is the back entrance to the Arndale, if you're familiar. Here is Selfridges and Marks and Spencer's. So she is full steam ahead at Marketplace. Here is a photo taken in the 60s of Marketplace. Unfortunately, not her establishment, but these buildings still exist. They had to be relocated, but they're still there. If you ever go to Manchester city centre, go around the back of Selfridges and you'll see the old Wellington Inn, and just next door, the Sinclair's Oyster Bar. So she starts a larger shop, and now she can do all the fancy confectionery that she had been doing at Arley Hall. She's closer to the market square where the Raffald brothers had their market gardens, plus all the other market stalls there too, where she managed to get things like sturgeon and turtle and really quite exotic stuff. She was closer to the posher bits of Manchester, and they're still considered the posher bits, Deansgate, King Street and St Anne's Square. She keeps the register office and the catering business, and the catering business gets so big that really, while she's doing all this in her spare time, I don't know where the spare time was, but in the spare time, she was essentially running the kitchens at a place called the Bull's Head, which is where I reckon where the Pizza Hut and the Warhammer shop is today, if you know Corporation Street in Manchester. She managed to get a sideline in perfumery, something that is not explained in the sources. Her nephew manages to become a very influential and talented perfumerer, and one of the people on his books is the King of Hanover. But anyway, it meant that she got a nice line in perfumes. So it was nice smelly things, lavender waters, powder for your wig, that sort of stuff. She started up a finishing school for young ladies. I'm exhausted just reading it, never mind, doing it. It's absolutely crazy. Important for us, 1769, she writes the first edition of the Experienced English Housekeeper. He's the first, or he's part of her first advert for it in the Manchester Mercury, where she's telling people, how many recipes there are, etc. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But just quickly to say, 2 years later, she does a second edition of Housekeeper. And then the year after that, she does her first edition of the Manchester and Salford Directory. At this point, there's 20,000 people living there. So this was not, it was no mean feat. And she was doing all this either pregnant, nursing, and recovering from pregnancy the whole time, because she was fulfilling her role as was expected of her in the 18th century, as a wife, and that was to, bear children. So the Experienced English Housekeeper, well, she completed 7 editions of it in her own lifetime. She raised the funding for it by subscription, which is, I guess, it's crowdfunding, what we would call today. And here's the rest of that advert. It's a very long, thin advert. I couldn't fit it all on one slide, at least not so that you could see it. And it says here, so what she would do is she would leave a sample of the book or some recipes from the book in various places. And you can see how well connected she was. These are all different shops around mainly the north of England, but also in London. You've got Doncaster, her hometown, York, there's Leeds, Kendal, Preston, Liverpool, and her own place, of course, in Manchester. It was quite a common way of funding a book, actually. You can find lots of examples, but I mean, she was so successful. She had more than 800 subscribers to it. Usually people would list the number of subscribers at the beginning of their book, but because there was so many, she couldn't put them in. At least that's what she said. She admits that it was deleterious to her health, and it must have been, bear in mind all the other plates she was spinning at the time. It was patronized by Lady Betty. It was really important to her. Well, first of all, because it gave a seal of approval from, somebody in the nobility, but also she'd learned her craft and really refined it and did lots of the really fancy foods in Alley Hall. So it might be Elizabeth's own intellectual property, as we might say it now. It was all funded by the Warburtons. And of course, it was Lady Betty who she was liaising with the most. So it's really important that she got that. The book's got 3 main sections to it. It's got savoury foods. So we're talking soup, fish, puddings, pies. I know we might not think of puddings as savoury, but well, we'll talk about that in a bit maybe. And then some of the ingredients you might need to make some of those foods and to carry them off well. The second part was her confectionery. So a lot of the things I've just mentioned, like her special gold and silver webs, her directions to set out a grand table, transparent puddings, trifles, whips, floating islands, fish ponds. That was another one of her jelly creations, all these little fish floating about in fish ponds covered in gold leaf. And then again, the most important part, but the most boring part, really, when it comes to reading the recipes, because they're all quite similar, but all very important. The pickling, the potting, the colouring, the making vinegars, ketchups, distilling, curing wines that have gone acidic, all sorts of stuff. And it was amazingly successful. And I just want to talk a little bit about why it was successful. First of all, it was the quality of the recipes and her confidence that she had in them. She gave all these samples out all around the country and said to people, you can trust me, or said to housewives, essentially, well-to-do housewives in big houses, you can trust me, I can help you. I can help you run your house. I can help you run your cooks. And it also helped cooks maybe who were working in houses for the first time and were a bit green themselves. It helped them out too, which kind of leads me on to my next point. This is the first time where we've got people working in kitchens or managing kitchens where they actually don't know necessarily what to do. Previously, people knew what to do, and recipe books really were just reminders, or maybe just give you some examples of some variations that you could do. But now some people were coming in fairly clueless. It might be a poor old maid of all work who's expected to do all the duties. So there had to be weights and measures used much more than ever before. People had to be walked through how to make things. She also puts excellent cues in her methods to tell you when things are ready. Again, usually a recipe, say you were frying fish, an old recipe would say something like, fry your fish in hot oil, and when it's enough, serve it forth. And you think, well, thanks very much. That's no use at all. But what she would say, and what she does say is, here's how you can tell it's ready. You take a sharp knife, poke it in. If you can move it away from the fish bones, it parts easily, your fish is ready. Then drain it, then put it in a hot dish, and then serve it forth. I mean, we will probably want more details than that now, but at the time, it was pretty cutting edge. The voice that she used is not condescending. She's a member of the domestic servant class, and she's talking to, some of the time anyway, other domestic servants and talking at their level. At the same time, because of course it's going to be housewives, and some of these housewives are ladies and viscounts and viscountesses rather, but she's not subordinate at all. She just says, trust me, I can help you express yourself, you know, with your food, which, you know, previous books in previous decades or centuries, usually written by men, you know, that just wasn't there. She's got the full gamut of ingredients and recipes. So there's things like, if you want a 6-page long recipe on how to properly cook and dress a turtle of 100 weight, it's there and it's represented. But there's also cod's head and shoulders. And there's things like stewed goose giblets. You know, it's all about good home economics. So really what she emphasized was, yeah, eat well, but you've got to eat wisely. So it's eating the whole of the animal. It's sticking to the seasons to bring down costs. Don't use butter, use suet more often. That fat that's you get found around the kidneys of cows, you can grate. I'm a big fan of it. She was anti-cullis. Now, the nearest thing we've got to cullis now is demi-glace, where you just kind of boil down stock made from a lot of meat. So it's very, very thick, and it's used to thicken sauce. It was extremely expensive. It required a lot of fuel to produce, and she's not having any of it. She has lots of other different suggestions of things that you can use. She had a finger on the pulse of food innovation and trends. She had ice cream in there. She had things like omelettes, things that we kind of think of as relatively modern. She had her gold webs. She had a finger on the pulse as well of the feeling of the nation. And that was, half the people wanted French cooking because it was expensive and it was fancy. And half the people were saying, what is this nonsense? What happened to the old-fashioned, good plain cooking of England, the puddings, the well-done roasts? People worried that we were kind of losing our food traditions. So what she did was, she said, okay, out with the French. We're going to get rid of all this opulence. But she said, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. We can actually learn a few things from them. And some of the things and some of the techniques that they have are actually really good. So what she could do was she took the best, or she kept the English, but combined it with the French technologies to produce something new. It was cutting edge at the time, but if you flick through the book, it's basically what we think now anyway of what is traditional British food and traditional British cooking. She's got some firsts. Her book is the first to contain a recipe for macaroni cheese. Here's another one of her flummery creations, this time cribbage cards, so playing cards. I mean, who can be bothered? Sweet patties, these are thought to be the direct descendant of Eccles cake. And I think most importantly here, she was the first person to come up with the idea of having a wedding cake rather than a wedding pie, although she called them, they were called bride's cake and bride's pies at the time. But what was really special here is she's the first person to do the double wrapping, if you like, of a layer of marzipan and then a layer of royal icing. Nobody had done that before, so we reckon that she maybe invented that one. And it's still the traditional choice for wedding cakes today. The royal family always have a wedding cake done in this way. And I know we kind of maybe go for posh stuff mainly for weddings and special events. But aside from weddings, it's also our Christmas cake. At least it is in Britain. So, that this cake is makes appearances at some of our most important celebrations and events. Even though you might not think it's a very special, a regular Christmas cake, it had to be invented at some point, and it was our Elizabeth, it seems, that invented it. She spent 6 years there. All of a sudden, strange notices start appearing in the Manchester Mercury. Here, H. Cooper, Widow Cooper. I did find her in one of Elizabeth's own directories. She takes up the register office from Elizabeth. There's also a notice saying Elizabeth's selling all of the food in her shop and a lot of the equipment in her shop. And the reason is when they place another notice, they've opened this huge, accustomed and commodious inn called the King's Head. It was in Salford, just over the river, just in Salford. And they intended, and they certainly did, entertained the nobility, gentry, merchants, and tradesmen. It was pretty fancy, and it was huge. It had a hotel. They kitted it out with brand new furniture. They essentially poured everything that they'd gained so far into this one venture. They put all their eggs in one basket. From now on, John's name is used and not Elizabeth's in the adverts, because we've gone from shop, which is fine, the domain of a woman, but now this is a high-class tavern, so now it's John's name that's used. They did, like I said, they really did do a lot of entertaining. At first, they were kind of on message, at least for John, because he did things like competitions, meetings of horticulturists, but eventually things like beefsteak clubs were being held there, which were, and other societies too, which, well, it was men's clubs basically, where they all got really drunk. It was just an excuse to get drunk, really. They were very, very popular at the time, but a really good money spinner. And John, being charismatic and handsome, was put front of house. So he was there entertaining all these people, getting drunk as well, and matching them drink for drink, because it kind of is now, masculinity and drinking is linked, and it certainly was in the 18th century. So if you were a real man, you better be knocking back the ports and the brandies. The success continues. She immediately does a second edition of the directory, and she has more housekeepers. But what's really important here is she sells the copyright before the third edition. And she sells it for £1,200. And I think she's the first woman to do this. I can't find another example anyway. Previously, what had happened is women wrote cookery books, and immediately the publisher bought the copyright from them at what seemed like a good price. But it must have been terribly galling when they saw that book go and be a bestseller. Well, Elizabeth had seen that happen to other people, and it wasn't going to happen to her. So she waited and sold it. And yeah, she's rich. There's a great story of Joshua, her nephew, sat watching the money being counted out in front of him, and he's all agog watching this big pile of cash. She's described by John Harland at this point as a lady bountiful, because she's well off. They are at the pinnacle of society in Manchester and Salford, and she becomes this great alms giver, a bit of a showy one, actually. You could say it was a bit tacky. But things start to go awry. Halfway through their stint at the King's Head, an advert appears. John Raffald, people assume it's John and not Elizabeth, starts up a morning coach and hearse service with this other guy called John Swain, who used to run a stagecoach business. It was a flop, and it folds. And things begin to unravel because, as I said, they'd used up all their cash flow going into the King's Head. This cost a lot of money. It went horribly wrong. John, at this point, because of all the entertaining and drinking, becomes, well, at best, very dependent on alcohol, but probably an alcoholic. his responsibilities as front of house isn't just entertaining, it's keeping an eye out. And his eye is not on the ball. And there's some major thefts from the place. Elizabeth, who has been running everything from the back, he suddenly have to be at back and front of house, and it all just starts to collapse. And before you know it, in 1779, there's a notice saying that they've gone bankrupt. So everything that she's achieved, all those shops that she's had, the record-breaking copyright to her book, it's all gone. There was hints in the Mercury. What had happened a few months before it closed, her sister, Mary Whittaker, had actually moved to Manchester and taken back the register office from Mrs. Cooper, and had also reopened essentially a carbon copy, it looks like, of Elizabeth's shop, because these are business models that work. And I guess this is an opportunity to try and claw back some money, but unfortunately it didn't work. They enter, well, they disappear for a few months, and then they enter the Exchange Coffee House, which is a dodgy coffee house in a dodgy bit of town. There's certainly people doing dodgy deals there. There's perhaps sex workers selling their wares there too. John is running it. It's turning into a bit of a drinking den in the evening. And it seems that aside from making some soup for the patrons, Elizabeth is having nothing to do with it. And she tries to make her own way. She does a third edition of the directory. She opens a ladies' stand at the Kersal Moor horse races, selling strawberries and cream to the ladies, tea, coffee, and chocolate as well. That's a very seasonal example. She does a 6th and a 7th edition of Housekeeper, and it looks like things actually might be turning round for her, but unfortunately, you know, John's still drinking, and perhaps she's putting all this work in, and if maybe she's just treading water. It's difficult to tell. But suddenly, 1881, about 18 months after moving into the Exchange Coffee House, she just drops dead without warning. Probably of an aneurysm or a stroke. You know, whatever it is that she has, it's described as a spasm in the sources, and within an hour she's died. This is the notice in the Manchester Mercury. I've not edited that down. That's literally it, one sentence, just announcing that she's passed away. Instantly, well, a couple of days, John is pronounced bankrupt again, and everything is sold. He absconds, is one version of the story, to London and becomes a teetotaler, a reformed man, gets remarried, moves back, and works for the rest of his days with his brothers in the market gardens. Some bit, Roy Shipperbottom and Charles Foster, I was lucky to see their correspondence between each other. Charles Foster gave me permission to look at their letters, and they were thinking the absconsion to London might have been a bit of gossip. They're not sure, but he definitely lived out most of the rest of his days in quiet, calm, doing the gardening. Elizabeth had gone, but her book lives on, or lived on. However, now that she's popped her clogs, Baldwin, the publisher, starts making changes, because although she sold that copyright, she was not letting him make any changes that she didn't approve. So changes sneak in. First thing, 8th edition, bang, portrait in there. She really did not want a portrait of herself to be in the book. It was about the food, not about her. But lucky for us, it's there because it's the only portrait we have of her. So, you know, Baldwin, after a few more editions, sells the copyright on, and things, well, it all goes a bit loony. There's lots of different versions of the book. Recipes get added in, sections get added in, recipes get taken out, recipes from other people. There's lots of plagiarism. So her recipes start appearing in other people's books. what's unusual and kind of amusing, I thought, anyway, you might not think so, but I'm going to say anyway, her portrait changes as you go through the editions. This is her a few editions later. John Harland, who wrote extensively about the different editions, he said of the original one about Elizabeth, the features are good, the character ladylike, with marks of decision and firmness about the lips, the forehead high and broad. And then he looks at this one, the 1803 one, and says that, oh, she's just a plump dairymaid looking person. But whilst there's all this unofficial and pirate editions and her recipes appearing in other people's books, usually by men who just weren't crediting their sources, usually, but women were doing it too. What it led to was a unification of food across the country. All of a sudden, there was actually a limited well of recipes all being spread around, and a good deal of those were Elizabeth's. Whether you knew it or not, you were cooking Elizabeth's food. There were other women too. There's Hannah Glass, Eliza Acton, people like that. She's not the only one, but it was her recipes that worked the best and were worded the best. So what I'm essentially saying is, this is the beginnings of the first time we've got a national cuisine. People in Newcastle are cooking the same things as people in Portsmouth. That had never really happened before. Slowly, she disappears. I realize that maybe disappears is the wrong word. Maybe it's dissolves. She is still there. She's just permeated into our conscience, you know, in England or in Britain, should I say, really, when we think of cuisine. Mrs. Beeton is the final nail in the coffin, however. Released almost 100 years after Elizabeth's book. It's edited by Mrs. Beeton, not written by her, by the way. And it is so comprehensive, you don't need another book. So whereas before, you might have a Raffald, and you might have a Hannah Glass book, and you might have an Eliza Acton book. Fine. Now you did not need one because everything was in there. And I'm not having to go from the point of view of the recipes. They work, and it's an amazing snapshot of the food eaten in England at the time. And I use it all the time. It's extremely useful. And now that's the problem, at least from people like Elizabeth's point of view. But what's ironic is the vast majority of these recipes were plagiarized, and they were plagiarized from 100 years of female writing. So the irony is, all these women's books were just blown out the water by their own recipes that had been recycled by Beeton, by James Beeton, really, who was a publisher, and Mrs. Beeton was his wife. But there are fans out there. There's chefs like Robert Owen Brown. He appears on the kitchen cabinet quite a lot. If you listen to that on Radio 4, he's a Manchester chef. He's championed her. In Canada, Jennifer McClagan, she even goes through the process of making your own calf's foot jelly using Elizabeth's recipe. So that's really interesting. Fergus Henderson, the nose to tail chef, has a lot of very similar recipes to Elizabeth. I'd be very surprised if you'd not heard of her. As I said, The Guardian, here's all the time, well, not all the time, at least certainly more than other newspapers do they write about Elizabeth. There's loads of stuff. Here's one from 1981. Christopher Driver and John Arlott wrote an article about the Manchester food scene, and they found out about Elizabeth and just couldn't understand that, as far as they knew at the time, there's no restaurant or anything called Elizabeth Raffald's. I mean, somebody needs to open that. I'm not doing it, but somebody else could. Roy Shipperbottom, he and working with some of Elizabeth's descendants, got a blue plaque up in Manchester city centre. It's still up. It's on the side of Selfridges. It's too small and high to see, and someone's graffitied all over it now, so you can't even read it. Ivan Day, who's doing, he's a really good food historian. He's done loads of work on it. He's recreated a lot of her dishes, much more than I have. And Suze Appleton, I mean, I talked about it at the beginning, but she also got Elizabeth shortlisted for a kind of competition where Manchester City Council said, we're going to have a statue of a woman from Manchester history who's important for the city. want people to pitch their women, and lots of people did in their droves. And she got to the final 6, but Emmeline Pankhurst won, unfortunately. Weirdly, when I was, this is just outside Manchester Central Library, where I did the bulk of my research. So I walked past that statue almost every day whilst I was researching the book. But I'm going to stop talking now because I realized I've gone down rabbit holes. I'm going to just say some very quick thank yous. Charles Foster, the retired historian, Annika Flower, the current historian at Ali Hall, just so amazingly helpful. It's just great. Suze Appleton for all the great groundwork that she'd put down. Ivan Day, I was very lucky to go up to his 17th century home in Cumbria, and he's got a lot of the equipment that Elizabeth Raffald used. I recorded the conversation that we had, and I put it on my podcast, the British Food History podcast. So if you haven't listened to that before and you're interested maybe in finding out a little bit more about Elizabeth, there's an episode with Ivan Day. And also Alessandra Pino very nicely took a bit of her time to read the book ahead of everyone else, and we had another discussion on the podcast about Elizabeth, so that's another thing. If you are interested in Elizabeth, you can of course buy the book, plug, but also there's loads of stuff about her on my blog, britishfoodhistory.com. So if you're not familiar with that, have a look. Sam Bilton, Mary Ann Bermans, both fantastic food historians, really helped me when it came to looking at the legend of Elizabeth. And of course, the staff at Manchester Central Library. I mean, I had to go through miles of microfilms for this. I was almost living there. So they were great, very patient. I'm not very good with technology, and I kept thinking I was breaking the microfilm machines. So they were great. And of course, thank you to everyone for listening. There's on my, if you want to contact me, maybe you know something about Elizabeth that you think I might not do or something like that, get in contact. I'm always very happy to hear about other people's relationships with Elizabeth.